Slow change rarely appears dangerous while it is happening. The mind does not experience gradual transformation as movement. It experiences continuity. Each day resembles the one before it, closely enough for perception to remain undisturbed. Beliefs survive not because they are constantly confirmed, but because contradiction arrives in increments too small to force recognition all at once. What changes slowly often enters awareness only after identity has already adjusted around it. By then, the change no longer feels new. It feels normal. This is why certain patterns repeat without requiring deception from outside. The distortion forms internally through the quiet preference for psychological continuity over interruption. Humans do not simply resist painful truths. They resist the instability created by noticing that what once felt permanent has already begun disappearing while they continued speaking, deciding, and believing as if nothing essential had moved. The belief usually begins in ordinary conditions. Stability appears visible enough to trust. A relationship feels secure because conflict remains manageable. A habit feels temporary because consequences remain distant. A public position feels defensible because contradiction remains incomplete. The conditions surrounding the belief do not appear false. They appear familiar. Familiarity creates the impression of permanence long before permanence is examined directly. Small inconsistencies emerge but remain absorbable. The explanation still functions. The identity connected to the belief still holds together. What cannot be questioned becomes equally important. The possibility that change is already underway remains unspoken because acknowledging it would alter behavior before certainty exists. The future is therefore treated as an extension of the present. Routines continue. Language remains unchanged. Commitments deepen around assumptions that have already begun weakening beneath them. The belief survives partly because no single moment appears large enough to justify abandoning it. Slow change protects itself through proportion. Nothing feels sufficient to force recognition individually, so recognition keeps postponing itself collectively. A statement is repeated publicly with calm confidence. The wording remains identical to earlier declarations, even though private hesitation has already begun forming behind it. The certainty becomes more visible precisely when reconsideration becomes harder to express. The mind prefers coherence to interruption. Not because coherence is always comforting, but because interruption forces reconstruction. Slow change threatens identity in a particular way. It does not announce a clear separation between before and after. Instead, it creates overlap. Old assumptions continue operating while evidence gradually weakens them. The result is not immediate denial. It is delayed adjustment. Contradiction is interpreted as temporary fluctuation rather than structural movement. Doubt remains manageable as long as it can still be framed as incomplete information instead of necessary revision. This creates a subtle reversal inside perception. The longer a belief has existed, the more evidence is required before the mind permits instability to reach conscious recognition. Certainty therefore becomes less responsive over time, not more accurate. Small signs are absorbed into existing interpretation because abandoning the interpretation would threaten continuity across memory, identity, and prior decisions. The belief does not survive because contradiction is absent. It survives because contradiction arrives too slowly to overcome psychological investment all at once. At first, the tension remains quiet. A person notices increasing distance inside conversations, but explains it through temporary exhaustion. A repeated disappointment becomes easier to ignore than confront, because confronting it would require reorganizing expectations already built around permanence. The mind delays recognition not through deliberate blindness, but through proportional adaptation. Each adjustment feels minor enough to preserve the larger assumption. Then another shift occurs. Doubt begins appearing not as open reconsideration, but as reinforcement. The belief is repeated more firmly. The commitment becomes more visible. Public certainty grows because private uncertainty has become more difficult to stabilize internally. This is one of the quieter recursions within human perception. Contradiction does not always weaken conviction immediately. Sometimes it intensifies the need to perform conviction outwardly in order to contain instability inwardly. A decision is announced after weeks of hesitation. Alternatives are dismissed quickly, almost impatiently. The conclusion appears settled not because uncertainty disappeared, but because remaining undecided became psychologically intolerable. The pattern deepens when identity becomes attached to continuity itself. At that point, recognition threatens more than a single belief. It threatens the image of the self that formed around maintaining consistency over time. To admit that slow change has already transformed reality would also require admitting that earlier confidence remained active after conditions had shifted. The mind often resists this, not because correction is impossible, but because retrospective instability begins spreading backward through memory. Previous judgments become uncertain. Earlier commitments appear exposed. The self no longer feels continuous, so perception narrows instead. Attention moves toward information that preserves coherence. Contradictions are not always rejected directly. They are reduced in emotional weight. The future is imagined as self-correcting. Temporary explanations multiply. The belief survives through reinterpretation rather than confrontation. Gradual deterioration becomes easier to tolerate than abrupt revision. This is why slow change often continues longest where attachment is deepest. The mind interprets continuity as evidence even after continuity has become performance. Familiar language remains active after confidence beneath it has weakened. The repetition itself begins creating temporary relief. Saying the belief aloud restores stability briefly because expression still resembles conviction from the outside. But the pressure does not disappear. It accumulates quietly underneath repetition. The individual begins sensing contradiction in moments too brief to fully examine. A pause after making a confident statement. Hesitation before reaffirming a commitment. Relief when difficult conversations are postponed again. These moments rarely become full recognition, because recognition would require movement before certainty exists. The mind continues waiting for a clearer boundary between truth and illusion, even while the absence of that boundary is precisely what allows the pattern to continue. Someone hears familiar words spoken back to them and recognizes their emptiness for a moment. The conversation continues without interruption. The response arrives automatically, preserving the exchange exactly as it existed before the hesitation appeared. Over time, the contradiction becomes more difficult to isolate because adaptation has already occurred internally. What once would have felt alarming now feels ordinary through repetition. Humans adjust emotionally to gradual transformation faster than they recognize it consciously. This creates another recursion. The ability to endure slow change becomes evidence that the change is survivable, which further delays confrontation with what has already been altered beneath endurance itself. Eventually a limit appears, not the limit of evidence, but the limit of self-recognition. The individual senses that doubt is no longer occasional. It has become structural. Yet the belief cannot fully adapt because too much identity remains connected to preserving continuity with the earlier self who believed more completely. Recognition becomes visible but unusable. The contradiction can be felt internally without being translated into meaningful revision. At this boundary, certainty changes form. It no longer functions as full belief. It functions as protection against disorientation. The mind continues repeating assumptions, partly because stopping would expose how long the tension remained active beneath conscious acknowledgement. The question becomes difficult to cross directly. If awareness arrives only after adaptation has already occurred, then what exactly is being protected when the old certainty continues speaking through the new uncertainty? The pattern remains unresolved because slow change never fully stops. Perception continues adjusting while believing itself stable. Doubt continues appearing in partial forms that rarely survive long enough to reorganize identity completely. Recognition arrives in fragments, then becomes absorbed into routine before transformation can feel definitive. The belief weakens gradually while the language surrounding it remains intact, and so the repetition continues quietly. People continue inhabiting assumptions that no longer fully correspond to what they privately sense. Commitments remain active after conviction has already thinned beneath them. Familiar explanations survive through momentum long after confidence begins, depending more on repetition than trust. Slow change rarely announces the moment it becomes irreversible, because the mind experiences most transformation while still calling itself unchanged. If you found meaning here, you're welcome to explore more on Timeless Questions, where we examine history not for answers, but for understanding.